My name is Vivian Alder, and the day I was erased from my husband's will, I realized that love alone is never enough to protect you. Not from betrayal, not from blood, not even from the people who once kissed your cheek and called you mother. You might actually regret missing out on this dramatic story. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when silence becomes strategy. And grief becomes the most dangerous kind of power. The letter came 3 days after the funeral, couriered in a crisp cream envelope, embossed with the name of the law firm my husband had sworn he'd never use again. He hated their billing practices, said they charged for paper clips. I should have known something was off the moment I saw that logo. I opened it slowly, carefully, the way you open a wound you can't avoid. The letter was brief, dry, legal. It read, per the last will and testament of Charles Alder, all assets including properties, investments, and residual estate are hereby transferred in equal shares to Michael Alder and Camilla Alder. Michael and Camilla? His children from his first marriage. No mention of me, no trust, no directive. Not even a personal note or a line of gratitude for 32 years of loyalty marriage and the quiet cleaning up of their chaos. I read it again and again, looking for some hidden clause, some last-minute amendment. Nothing. I wasn't just cut out. I was erased, as if I had never existed. I didn't cry. Grief is strange that way. It waits behind shock, hides in the seams of logic, and I'm a logical woman. A former real estate attorney trained to read between lines to search for the traps hidden in plain sight. But this was something else entirely. I sat at the kitchen table, the one Charles and I had chosen together 25 years ago from an antique shop in Vermont. I stared at the wood grain as if it might offer a different truth. 32 years. I had managed his calendar, his medications, the estate tax prep, his bridge group drama. I had held him through surgeries, driven him to his brother's funeral, buried his secrets when the kids didn't show up for birthdays. And in return, he handed them everything. The house, the lake property, the portfolio, and me. He handed me silence. Michael called the next morning. "Hi, Viv," he said with a little too much brightness in his voice. "Just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." I didn't respond right away. Then I asked, "Did you know?" A pause, a practiced sigh. I mean, Dad mentioned some changes, but we didn't get into the details. Camilla called 2 hours later. She didn't even try to fake concern. "Look, this was Dad's decision," she said flatly. "It's not personal." "It's entirely personal," I replied. "You got everything. I got nothing." "Well, maybe that says something, doesn't it?" she said, about how he felt. Then she hung up. That night, I poured a glass of wine I didn't want and sat by the fireplace Charles had installed for me on our 20th anniversary. The one he said would keep us warm until the end. Turns out the end came early, and I was left out in the cold. The lawyers confirmed it. The will was legitimate, finalized 6 months before his death. No indication of coercion, no red flags, and no recourse. I could fight it, sure, but the public mess, the emotional cost, the years it would take. No, I chose something else. I chose to disappear. Not literally. I didn't run, but I left the house, quietly, packed only what was mine, gave up the keys, gave up the title, gave up the battle I knew would only end in more humiliation. Let them think they won. Let them decorate my home in their new furniture, toast to a fresh start over the same table where I once fed them homemade ravioli. Let them think I was too broken to fight. Because what they didn't know was that while they inherited property, I understood how property works. And that would become everything. I moved into a modest apartment on the west side of town. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom. Crown molding chipped in places. A view of the parking lot. But it was mine. No inherited ghosts. No curated furniture. No stepchildren walking across floors I paid for. Just quiet. And space to think. Because the truth is, I didn't leave to sulk. I left to study. I began with the will. My late husband had left everything to Michael and Camilla, but I knew Charles. He wasn't reckless. He didn't make emotional decisions, at least not without planting legal landmines to protect himself. So why had he used Lockridge and Boyd, a firm he openly disliked? And why had the trust documents excluded our joint holdings? I pulled every file I had, scanned old tax returns, checked archived emails, dug through the shared safe deposit box that miraculously I still had access to. What I found wasn't just suspicious, it was surgical. 6 months before his death, Charles had moved his assets from personal accounts into a holding company, North Bay Equity Group. From there, ownership passed to designated primary beneficiaries listed as Michael Alder and Camilla Alder. It was clean. Too clean. I dug deeper. North Bay wasn't just a shell. It owned actual real estate, high-end, multifamily rental properties, commercial lots, even mortgage packages bundled from secondary buyers. It wasn't flashy, just quiet, dependable revenue, the kind people don't notice until it controls their home. I checked the registry. 3 properties popped up immediately. Camilla's house in Deerfield, Michael's suburban McMansion in Grayson Park, a third one, small business office space used by a mortgage servicing subsidiary. My eyes narrowed. They hadn't inherited free homes. They had inherited mortgaged assets, ones now managed by a corporate parent. And that corporate parent was North Bay Equity, which meant I could get in. And if I got in, I could get above. The next week, I reached out to an old colleague, a retired venture attorney named Leah, who owed me more than one favor from our courtroom days. "You still keep an eye on mid-size holding companies?" I asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Who are you looking at?" "North Bay Equity Group." I heard her flipping pages. Then she paused. "Oh," she murmured. "That name's come up." "Badly." "No, not badly. Just quietly. They're discreet. But they're buying up defaulted assets left and right. Industrial parks, inherited mortgages, old shopping centers with redevelopment potential." My heartbeat sped up. "What about shareholder access?" "They've got preferred shares, hard to get. But common shares, open market, especially through proxy buyers." I smiled. That night I opened a new account, then a second under an LLC I quietly registered in Vermont. Then I bought in, slowly, carefully, in fractions. Over the next 3 months I acquired 2% of North Bay Equity's common shares. Then I waited for their quarterly shareholder meeting and requested a full financial disclosure packet, just like any minority owner is entitled to. When it arrived, I felt my hands tremble for the first time since Charles died, because there in black and white was the thing no one in the family realized. The company that managed Michael and Camilla's mortgages, the one sending them statements, processing their escrow accounts, even threatening foreclosure if they missed payments, was a wholly owned subsidiary of North Bay Equity. They didn't own their homes. They leased them from the bank. And I was the bank's newest partial owner. I didn't feel powerful. Not yet. But I felt present. For the first time since that funeral, I wasn't erased. I was embedded. Not in their lives, but in their walls. 2 days later, Camilla called me. "We're doing some renovations," she said breezily. "Just thought you should know since the contractor might be in touch." The house technically came from Dad's estate. "Is it paid off?" I asked. She paused. "What? The house. Is it fully paid?" "Well, no," she said. "But Dad left us the mortgage. It's under our name now." "Actually," I said quietly, "it's under the name of Bayserve Capital Management, which as of this quarter is majority owned by North Bay." "Okay. And I own 2% of North Bay." Silence. "What are you saying?" she finally whispered. "I'm saying, Camilla," I said, sipping my tea, "that technically every month you're paying rent." "To me." She hung up. I sat still, and for the first time in my life, smiled in a way I never had before. It wasn't joy. It wasn't victory. It was justice. The kind you build brick by brick in the dark, while everyone else thinks you've vanished. The silence after Camilla hung up wasn't just satisfying, it was educational. Because when someone like her goes quiet, it means they're doing one of two things: panicking or planning. Either way, I was ready. 3 days passed. No calls. No texts. Not even a passive-aggressive email. I didn't reach out. I let the weight of her new reality settle in. Let her reread her mortgage paperwork. Let her realize that the hardwood floors she bragged about on Facebook every week weren't actually hers. Let her come to terms with the fact that her kitchen island might technically belong to her father's widow, the woman she'd erased with a signature. On the fourth day, Michael called. He tried to sound calm. His voice was smooth, controlled, like a man trying to negotiate a golf club membership instead of a family betrayal. Vivian, he began, I think we need to talk. Not about the past, just where we are now. I'm listening, I said. Look, we didn't know about the mortgage thing. Honestly, Dad told us everything was clean, that the houses were secured through the trust. I said nothing. So, we'd really appreciate it if you could, you know, step back a little. This feels like a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, no misunderstanding at all. You're just experiencing the terms of a deal you never bothered to read. A beat. Then, are you trying to punish us? No, I said. I'm reminding you that just because you had the pen doesn't mean you wrote the ending. He exhaled sharply. What do you want, Vivian? I want what you took from me, I said softly. Control. Stability. Respect. You want the houses? No, I said. I already have them. That evening, I reviewed the files again. Bayserve Capital Management was more than just a mortgage servicer. It had a clause embedded deep in its borrower agreements, a lien trigger, that allowed the parent company to initiate property reassessment after 2 consecutive late payments. Michael had missed 1 payment last month. Camilla had refinanced her kitchen remodel with a high-interest line of credit. They were both vulnerable. I didn't want their homes. I wanted them to know I could take them. That I had the power they thought they had stolen. Mara, my oldest friend, stopped by with tea and cookies. She had been silent through most of this, watching, reading between my words. She was a therapist once before retirement. She knew better than to interrupt someone mid-revenge. So she said, "Are you going to evict them?" I shook my head. No, that's not the point. Then what is? I stirred my tea slowly. To make them live with it. To make every mortgage statement feel like a mirror. She raised an eyebrow. And if they stop paying? Then I legally foreclose, I said. Just like any investor would. But only if they give me a reason. Mara sipped her tea, then murmured, "You know, there's a thin line between poetic and ruthless." I've lived on that line for 32 years, I said. I just never had the pen until now. A week later, Camilla reached out again. This time she asked to meet. We met at the old country club, Neutral Territory. She arrived in designer heels, face powdered, voice tight. Gone was the smugness. What replaced it was something closer to desperation masked with civility. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said, arms crossed. You never even liked the company. You never cared about Dad's businesses. I cared about what he built, I said. Not because it made money, but because it gave him meaning. And he threw all of that to you like I never existed. She exhaled sharply. He said you didn't want it. He said a lot of things, I replied. A server brought coffee. She didn't touch hers. I can't afford a payment hike, she blurted. I just got the notice. I tilted my head. Inflation adjustment clause, I said. Perfectly legal. Part of the original loan structure your father approved. You're going to ruin us. No, I said softly. I'm going to remind you. Of what? That you can't erase someone without consequences. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. Camilla never cried when it would actually serve her. She stood to leave. I hope this makes you feel powerful. It doesn't, I said, but it makes me feel present. That night, I stood on my apartment balcony watching the lights flicker on across the city. Somewhere out there, Camilla was pacing in her pristine kitchen, probably calling Michael. Somewhere they were calculating, regretting, scrambling. And me, I stood still. No tears, no victory speech, just quiet breath. And the knowledge that I no longer lived in anyone's shadow. Not even his. The phone didn't ring for a week. Not from Michael. Not from Camilla. Not from the lawyers they usually ran to the moment life stopped going their way. And in that quiet, I found the space I needed to go deeper. I wasn't finished. What I had done so far was simple, surgical. I had pressed just enough to make them squirm. But I hadn't touched the foundation yet. The rot beneath their entitlement. The question that had haunted me since the will arrived. Why? Why would Charles, my husband, my partner of over 3 decades, cut me out with such precision? No slip, no oversight. Just deletion. The betrayal still tasted bitter, but I needed to understand it before I could finish what I started. So I went back to the beginning, back to the archives. Charles had been meticulous with his paperwork. He filed everything in leather-bound folders and cross-referenced notes in tiny handwriting. Even when we argued, he tracked adjustments to our living trust with lawyer-like efficiency. I still had his old laptop stored in a lockbox in my closet. It took me a while to remember the password. VivLove87. I almost laughed. The man who loved me enough to make me the code, but not enough to leave me the house. Or maybe I typed in a search. Trust amendment. Dozens of files popped up. Most were old, generic, but one stood out. Final Revocable Trust, Rev 3. Docs. I opened it. At first it was what I expected. Transfer of assets to Michael and Camilla, some boilerplate language about residual estate distribution. But in the comments pane there were red-tracked edits, notes. And there, highlighted in yellow, was the smoking gun. Vivian has her own funds. She won't need this. Too many emotional decisions lately, best to simplify. The edits weren't from Charles. They were from Camilla. I checked the metadata. File modified from an IP that didn't match Charles's home address, but matched the office building Camilla worked in part-time. She had edited his will, maybe not the final signed version, but she had influenced it, guided it, coached him into rewriting a legacy. And knowing Charles, who was terrified of conflict, he probably convinced himself it was for the best. After all, I'd always handled myself. Never asked for much. Never demanded my share. And that was my mistake. I gave them the illusion that I didn't need protection. So they left me naked in the storm. I called Leah again. Let's talk trusts, I said. She sighed. You're going to make me work, aren't you? Only if you want to see something poetic. She chuckled. Tell me. I want to set up a real estate trust. One that can purchase residential properties under an umbrella holding and rent them out at reduced rates, long-term stable housing for single mothers and women over 50. Like a nonprofit. Not quite. A for-purpose trust. It generates income but reinvests it all. Zero payout to shareholders. And how will you fund the purchase? I'm going to start, I said slowly, with the foreclosure. Rights on 2 properties. I already partially control. She paused. You're serious? Completely. Won't that make you the villain? I stared out the window at the sun breaking through gray clouds. No, I said. It'll make me the architect. Over the next few weeks, I worked in silence. I moved pieces carefully. I submitted a notice of lien reassessment on Camilla's home. Michael had missed another mortgage payment, so I activated the escalation clause just enough to freeze his access to refinancing. And then I did something unexpected. I sent them each a letter. It read, You have 60 days to vacate your respective properties. You may apply to rent them through the Alder Wren Housing Trust after they are restructured. Priority will be given to tenants with hardship records and long-term instability. Applications are open to all. No preference given to prior tenants. Camilla replied within the hour. You can't be serious. These are our homes. Ours. Michael was quieter. He wrote a single sentence. Dad would be disgusted. I didn't respond. Because I wasn't doing this for Charles. Not anymore. I was doing it for every woman who stood quietly in the background making things work, while the people they supported handed their futures to someone else. On the 59th day, I visited the properties. Camilla had already left. The front porch was bare. The flower pots gone. But the echo of her perfume still lingered in the air like a memory that refused to evaporate. Michael hadn't moved. A foreclosure notice was taped to his door. He hadn't even bothered to peel it off. I stood on the curb and waited. He came out. Didn't look angry. He looked hollow. This is who you've become, he asked. No, I said. This is who you made me become. And then I walked away. The houses were quiet now, empty of voices but full of consequence. And that was how I preferred them. Not abandoned but reset. Because this wasn't about taking something away. It was about redefining what they thought they owned. They had treated inheritance like a birthright, as if blood and paperwork were enough to override history, effort, love. But they forgot something. They forgot I had built part of that legacy too. Maybe I didn't sign the title deeds. Maybe my name wasn't on the headlines or in the family trust. But I'd been in the margins of every deal, every dinner, every silent compromise that made their lives possible. So now I was reclaiming the story, not by arguing over the ink, but by rewriting the margins. The Alder Wren Housing Trust was officially launched that spring. The name Wren was my mother's. She had died renting a home she could never afford to buy, evicted 2 weeks after her cancer diagnosis when she couldn't make the last rent check. Back then I couldn't help her. Now I could help women like her. The 2 properties I had reclaimed were converted under the trust's ownership. New appliances, fresh paint. Backyard gardens planted with perennials instead of Camilla's showy seasonal florals. Within weeks we received over 80 applications. I approved 2. One was a mother of 3 whose husband had drained her accounts and disappeared. The other was a 61-year-old retiree who'd been couch surfing after her landlord tripled the rent. When I handed them the keys, they cried. Not because the houses were luxurious, but because for the first time in years they had security. "I don't know how to thank you," one whispered. "You already have," I said. "By surviving." They didn't know who had lived in those homes before. They didn't need to, because now they were reclaiming space just like I had. A few weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten. From Camilla, "Vivian, you win. Congratulations. You took the homes. You took our comfort. But I hope you know, you lost something too. Dad trusted you, and this is what you did with it. Enjoy the silence." Camilla. I didn't respond, but I sat with her words for a while, rolled them around like stones in my hand. Because she was right about one thing. I had lost something, but it wasn't Charles. It was the illusion that love would be enough to protect me from betrayal. And now that the illusion was gone, I was finally free. Michael didn't write, but I heard from one of his old colleagues that he had sold his car downsized to an apartment and started consulting again. Word was he told people he stepped away from real estate to focus on simplicity. Simplicity, of course, being code for consequences. I hoped he found some version of peace. But I didn't chase it for him. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid in full. Some are meant to linger, quiet, permanent, like the unpaid balance on an old mortgage. That summer, the trust expanded. We bought a 3rd home, this one in a small coastal town. A fixer-upper, salt-worn and crooked but full of promise. I named it the second house, not for its place in the purchase list, but for what it represented. The second chance, the second voice, the second version of myself that rose after grief tried to bury the first. Mara helped with the renovations. Leah brought in a grant writer. Even the women who had moved into the first 2 houses offered their time, planting gardens, painting walls, sharing coffee stories around the folding table we used for board meetings. We weren't just rebuilding homes. We were building something irreversible, a new kind of legacy. One not written by blood but by intent. And this time, no one could write me out. The letter came on a Wednesday. Plain envelope. No return address. Just my name handwritten in a shaky scrawl that felt strangely familiar. Inside a single page. "You may think you've won, Vivian, but we still have the name, and the name is what matters. M. I didn't need a signature. Only one person in my life still clung to legacy like it was armor. Michael. I held the letter for a long time, not because it scared me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Michael didn't understand power. He still thought legacy came from nameplates on doorways, from family crests and inherited titles. He didn't realize that the world had changed. That power had shifted quietly, slowly, irrevocably, and that I was now sitting in the very seat he thought would always be his. The next week, I received a call from an investor group that had once partnered with Charles. "Vivian," the voice said smoothly, "we've heard about the trust. Impressive initiative." "Thank you," I said. "It's personal, of course. That's why we're calling." One of our subsidiaries is expanding a mortgage product line into female-focused housing investments. "We'd like to invite you to speak at our forum." I paused. A year ago, they wouldn't have remembered my name. Now, they wanted me on stage. "I'll think about it," I said, "but only if I can talk about what not to do with power." The man chuckled nervously. "We'll get back to you." That night, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. It had become a ritual since the trust began. I liked watching porch lights flick on at dusk, families eating quietly behind their windows, dogs curled at doorsteps. Stability. Earned, not inherited. At the end of the block stood the newest trust property, a small 2-bedroom house with a crooked mailbox and rose bushes that refused to die no matter how often they were trimmed. Inside, a woman named Ellie lived with her teenage daughter. She was a former teacher, divorced, had once been on the verge of living in her car. Now she baked bread every Sunday and left loaves for the neighbors. Her daughter had made honor roll. Ellie waved from the window as I passed. I waved back, something tight loosening in my chest. This was legacy, not the kind you fight over in courtrooms, not the kind scribbled into cold estate plans, the kind you build with your bare hands. A week later, I got word through the grapevine. Michael had rebranded his name. He was now M. Alder Strategic Holdings, trying to distance himself from the press release I had issued 2 weeks earlier about the trust's expansion into formerly foreclosed properties, trying to erase the connection between his past and my present. It wouldn't work, because no matter how many times he scrubbed it, people remembered stories, and our story, mine and his, was becoming something other women whispered about, shared in secret, held like flint in their palms. I wasn't just reclaiming my voice. I was becoming a myth. The kind that slips into dinner conversations, into side eyes at charity galas, into murmured warnings in corporate hallways. Don't cross her. Don't forget her. Or she'll buy the building your ego lives in. One evening, Mara brought over a bottle of wine. We sat on my back porch, the summer wind warm against our skin. I heard you got invited to speak again, she said, smiling. 3rd time this month, I nodded. Seems the world finally wants to hear from the ghost they thought was gone. Mara leaned back. You know, she said, revenge gets old. But building something out of it, that never does. I raised my glass. To foundations, I said. And to cracks, she replied. They let us rebuild smarter. We laughed. The stars above us blinked like ancient secrets, and somewhere inside me, a deeper peace settled. This wasn't the end. This was the architecture of something lasting, and I was just getting started. A letter arrived from the city. Not from Michael, not from Camilla, not from the ghosts of my past, but from the Department of Urban Housing and Development. They'd noticed the trust's work quiet, consistent, and unusually fast in turnaround. The envelope contained a proposal, a partnership. They were offering a 3-house donation in a blighted zone on the edge of town. Land value, low. Community risk, high. Return on investment, practically zero. But the letter ended with one line that made my breath catch. We believe you can bring these homes back to life. Not profit, not prestige, life. I stared at those words for a long time. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have known what to do with them. I'd have forwarded the letter to Charles, maybe asked if we had the capacity to help. Now I had a plan. The next week, I stood before the city committee in a gray pantsuit. No pearls, no posture of a grieving widow. I was not here to mourn. I was here to build. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, you don't need another nonprofit with a brochure. You need a revolution in how we define housing. You need legacy that isn't tied to a last name, but to a last chance. I showed them the maps. The before and after photos of Ellie's garden, of the single mom who installed a community library on her front lawn. I told them about Leah, who gave up her weekends to teach residents about budgeting and estate law. And I told them about Charles, not as a villain, but as a man who thought he was protecting his family by entrusting everything to the wrong hands. Hands that wore expensive rings but never lifted a single brick. My husband died thinking his legacy was in safe hands, I said. I'm here to make sure it finally is. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded slowly, deeply, like people watching something sacred rise from ashes. 2 days later, I got the call. Approved. 3 new homes, fully deeded to the Alder Wren Trust. Tax incentives included. Camilla found out the following week. Not because I told her, but because the local paper did. A front-page story. Widow reclaims voice, rebuilds community with Justice housing model. Her name wasn't mentioned, but her old kitchen was A once luxury home now converted into low-cost, long-term housing for single-income women, features repurposed amenities including a wine fridge turned food pantry. Camilla was livid. She called me from an unlisted number. "Is this your revenge?" "No," I said. "This is my answer." "To what?" she hissed. "To a question you never bothered to ask." "What question?" I paused, then said softly, "What does it feel like to be erased?" Silence. Then the click of a line going dead. I didn't hear from her again. Not directly, but Mara later mentioned she'd started seeing a therapist, and that she'd moved into a smaller home, one she could actually afford. That felt right. I didn't need her to apologize. I just needed the story to balance. And now it was starting to. That fall, we hosted our first community dinner in the garden of the second house. Fairy lights, plastic chairs, lemon bars made by Ellie's daughter. I looked around at the laughter, the secondhand dishes, the mismatched tablecloths, and I thought, this is what inheritance should feel like. Not marble countertops or silent corridors full of portraits, but people gathered, choosing each other. Leah raised her glass. To Vivian, she said, "The woman who didn't just survive betrayal, she built a cathedral from it." I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The cathedral Leah spoke of wasn't made of stone. It was made of letters. Eviction notices turned into welcome packets. Bank statements rewritten into rental agreements. Wills that once erased my name now recycled into compost for the garden beds. One morning, I stood inside the first house we ever reclaimed, Camilla's old place, and noticed something small, but important. A crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator. A wobbly house with a crooked heart on the roof. Underneath, a name written in block letters. Home. That's all it said. Not Mom's house. Not Aunt Viv's. Not even the trust. Just home. And somehow that one word felt like more than Charles ever gave me in ink. The next wave came fast. 3 new homes. Then 6. Then 8. Each with a story. Each with a woman who had been overlooked, discarded, or doubted. I learned their names. I remembered their faces. I asked them to never forget who they were before the world tried to rename them. The trust held an orientation for new tenants, and I stood at the front of the room looking out at their wary, cautious eyes. "I don't want you to be grateful," I told them. "I want you to be fierce." They laughed, some softly, some with tears caught in their throats. A few months ago, these women were filing bankruptcy, or sleeping in cars, or choosing between groceries and rent. Now, they had keys, and something deeper than shelter. They had the beginning of dignity. One day, while sorting old trust documents, I came across something unexpected. A voicemail stored in my digital backup. Timestamp, 6 months before Charles died. I played it. "Viv, it's me. I know we've had our differences. I know the kids want me to update things. I haven't figured it out yet. Maybe we talk, maybe we don't. But if you ever wonder, I still trust you. Always have." My hands shook. Because even though the will said otherwise, Charles hadn't been sure. He'd been pushed, persuaded, manipulated, and maybe he hadn't had the strength to resist. But he'd left this breadcrumb, this small, shaky voice in the dark. I saved the file, labeled it his real will, because to me it was worth more than notarized signatures or embossed seals. It was the last truth he left unfiltered, and that was enough. Later that week, I visited his grave. I hadn't been back since the funeral. It wasn't out of bitterness, just unfinishedness. Like a conversation paused too long. The headstone read, "Charles Alder, devoted husband, father visionary." I placed a small stone on top and whispered, "You missed the real legacy, Charles. But don't worry, I found it for you." Then I tucked the voicemail note beneath a nearby tree root wrapped in wax paper, buried like a secret waiting to be found. Not for the world. For me. On my way home, I drove past Michael's new office. It was smaller than his old one. No glass corner view. No luxury car in the lot. But the sign on the door still carried the Alder name. I stopped at a red light watching him through the window. He was sitting alone, staring at a computer, his shoulders hunched in the way of someone carrying more than just paperwork. I didn't wave, didn't honk. I just watched. Not with vengeance, but with something stranger. Pity. because he still believed the world owed him something because of the name he inherited. He didn't understand that names can't protect you from your own emptiness. Only truth can, and I had finally learned to live inside mine. The first time someone called me a matriarch, I laughed. It happened during a trust fundraiser. A woman I barely knew leaned in glass of white wine in hand and said, "You're like the quiet matriarch of justice around here." I almost corrected her. I almost said, "No, no, I was just the wife. The woman behind the man." But that wasn't true anymore. I hadn't been just the wife in a long time. I'd become the one writing checks, leading teams, buying buildings, and doing it without anyone's permission. That's when it hit me. Matriarch wasn't a title someone gave me. It was a role I stepped into after being pushed out of every other room. One Thursday afternoon, I returned to the trust office to find Mara waiting with a smirk. "You're in the paper again," she said, handing me a folded copy of the Herald. There I was, photo and all. Headline: "From Erased to Empowered. Widow turns family betrayal into housing revolution." I sat down slowly. It was surreal. Not because of the fame, but because the world was finally naming what I had quietly been building. A movement. Not revenge, not restitution, but a full rewrite of what it means to lose everything and then build it back in your own name. But just as momentum surged, the past reared its head. A lawyer showed up with a file. "Miss Alder," he said carefully, "this is from Charles's estate. We've reopened the file due to new evidence." "Evidence?" I asked. He opened the folder. Inside, a draft of a revised will dated 2 weeks before Charles died. Signed but not notarized. Names scratched out. New ones written in. Mine included. "What does this mean?" I asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Technically, it's not enforceable, but it could be enough to contest the existing version." I stared at the paper. My name, so long absent, finally there, clear and unapologetic. I could use this. I could challenge everything. Drag Michael and Camilla into court. Win back titles, assets, headlines. But instead, I asked, would I own the trust if I did that? He blinked. "The trust is already yours." I smiled. "Then I have what I need." And I pushed the folder back across the table. The next day I burned it. Not out of hatred, out of freedom. Because the most powerful thing I could do wasn't reclaim a legal document. It was decline the invitation to the war they wanted. They had tried to destroy me in ink. But I had built something they couldn't touch. People, homes, a future. They wrote me out of the past. But I had become the author of what came next. Weeks later, a young intern named Danny joined the trust. Bright-eyed, brilliant, the kind of fire I used to keep hidden behind polite smiles. One afternoon, she knocked on my door. "I read your story," she said shyly. "I want to be like you someday." I looked at her, and I saw my younger self, just with better shoes and bolder dreams. "You don't want to be like me," I said. She blinked, confused. "You want to be better? Start from where I ended." She smiled. "That's the plan." And as she left the room, a single thought followed her. They tried to silence me, but now I've become the voice behind 1,000 others. There are moments, rare, quiet ones, when the chaos stops long enough for you to hear the echo of your own life. For me, it happened in the middle of a rainstorm. I was sitting in the community room at House 7 watching raindrops race each other down the window panes, listening to the kettle whistle in the background. Across from me sat Rosa, a 72-year-old tenant who had once lived in her car for nearly 6 months. She was crocheting a blanket for her granddaughter. "Vivian," she said softly, not looking up, "do you ever miss them?" I didn't need to ask who she meant. Michael, Camilla, even Charles. I stirred my tea. "Yes," I said, "but not the way you think." She looked up. "I don't miss who they were. I miss who I pretended they were." Rosa nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. Loss isn't just about people. It's about the stories we lose when we realize the characters were never who we believed. That same week, I received an invitation. A national conference on ethical housing wanted me as their keynote speaker. The theme, redefining legacy, when the ones who build it are forgotten. I almost declined. But then I thought of Danny and Rosa and every other woman who walked into our homes with her shoulders hunched and walked out with her chin raised. So I accepted And 3 months later, I stood on stage in front of 800 people, floodlights warming my face, microphone trembling slightly in my hand. My name is Vivian Archer, I began, voice steady. I was cut out of a will. And for a while, I thought that meant I'd been erased. Pause. Breathe. But what I didn't realize is that being cut out only matters when you believe the page was sacred. I don't. I saw nods, silent tears. I believe in rewriting the page, in taking back the pen, in building houses that outlive betrayal. That's what legacy looks like when it's made, not inherited. The audience rose. Applause rang through the hall like a thunderclap. Not for revenge, but for the revolution we were living quietly, house by house. Back in my office, a photo sat on my desk. Not of Charles. Not of the kids. It was a wide-angle print of the front steps of all 10 homes we had converted each, with a woman standing in the doorway, some holding hands with children, some alone, but smiling wide. Underneath in gold ink were 3 words. Still standing. Stronger. Leah had gifted it to me on the anniversary of the trust. And every time I looked at it, I remembered. I wasn't rebuilding my life. I was building a map for those still trapped in theirs. One night, just before closing up, Mara walked into my office holding a letter. She looked pale. You might want to read this. I opened it. It was a formal letter from a holding group representing one of Michael's last business ventures. The company was failing. He had mismanaged it, siphoned funds, left contracts hanging. They were offering to sell, not just assets, everything, the company's name, Alder Properties. My breath caught. They wanted me to buy the very business that once funded the homes they used to hold over my head. I leaned back, heart thudding. This was not just poetic. This was a full-circle weapon with a velvet handle. Do you want it? Mara asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I closed the folder, stared out the window at the trust sign glowing against the night. Did I want it? Did I want to own what they thought defined them? Maybe. But maybe. I could do something even better. Something they'd never expect. Something unforgettable. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the offer, but because of the possibility it carried. Owning Alder Properties would be the ultimate twist, the kind of poetic justice that makes headlines and haunts dinner parties. The kind of revenge that doesn't come with raised voices but with receipts and real estate deeds. But revenge had never been the point. Redirection had. The next morning, I called a meeting. Leah, Mara, Danny, a few of our lead tenants who had become informal mentors in the trust. I placed the offer on the table. This is the company that used to finance the homes. I was never welcome in, I said. Now they want me to buy it. Mara raised an eyebrow. You're considering it. Yes, I said, but not to keep it. Everyone leaned in. I continued. I want to dismantle it, brick by brick, then rebuild it under a new name. Not for profit, not for prestige. For people. Leah smiled slowly. You're going to give their legacy to the women they ignored. Exactly, I said. A silence settled in the room, not uncertain, but reverent. We weren't just changing ownership. We were rewriting who gets to own the future. The deal closed within 6 weeks. Michael never reached out. Camilla sent a terse 3-line email asking if she'd be able to keep her consulting fees. I didn't respond. Instead, I drafted a press release. The former Alder Properties has been acquired by the Wren Collective, a justice-led housing enterprise founded by Vivian Archer. All profits will now fund female-led housing co-ops, survivor assistance programs, and financial independence mentorships. This is not a takeover, the statement read. It's a handover from ego to equity. The release went viral. Not because of the headline, but because of the photo. It showed me standing in front of the Alder Building, arms folded, wearing a blazer over jeans and a shirt that read, "Don't mistake silence for surrender." The backlash was quiet but real. Old family friends sent curt messages. You didn't have to humiliate them. This could have been handled with more discretion. Think of the family name. I deleted them all. The name never protected me. The silence never saved me. But this bold refusal to vanish quietly was the only thing that ever gave me power. One rainy evening, I walked into the Alder boardroom for the first time. The room was cold, industrial, covered in gray leather and brushed steel. On the walls hung portraits of every past CEO: Charles, Michael, men in sharp suits with eyes like shut doors. I walked to the far end of the room and pulled out a frame from under my coat. It was a photo of Ellie, holding her daughter on the steps of their trust home. I hung it dead center on the wall between Charles and Michael, then turned and walked out. Let them stare at her forever. Weeks later, the press began calling the transformation the Archer shift. Articles circulated in journals about what happened when women reclaimed the tools once used against them. One headline read, "She wasn't in the will, now she owns the walls." Another, "When the matriarch buys the patriarch's palace." Danny printed that one and taped it to the break room fridge. I didn't mind, because I wasn't just in the story anymore. I was the story, and this chapter was finally mine to write. Owning the company changed nothing and everything. I didn't sit in the CEO chair or redecorate the office in velvet and vengeance. I left most of it untouched except for one thing: the contracts. I rewrote every clause in every housing agreement under the new Wren Collective brand. No fine print that punished single mothers. No hidden fees that penalized tenants for speaking out. No auto-renewals that trapped people into cycles of debt. Instead, we wrote in rent forgiveness for survivors of domestic abuse, equity credits for long-term tenants, mentorship pairings between renters and financial counselors. Every document we drafted became a new page in the book they tried to keep me from writing. And people noticed. One afternoon, a man approached me after a housing conference. Gray suit, mid-40s, clipboard in hand. "Are you Vivian Archer?" "Yes." He hesitated, then said, "I'm Michael's son, from his first marriage." I doubt he ever mentioned me. He hadn't. "I follow your work," he said quietly. "I just wanted to thank you. You changed everything. For people like me, for people he forgot." And then he handed me a card. Real estate community. First initiatives. His own company. His own way of rewriting a lineage. He didn't ask for anything, just nodded and left. I stood there stunned. The legacy Charles and Michael hoarded in ink and entitlement was finally bleeding out into the world in the best way possible. Back home, I opened the window of my study. Rain tapped against the glass again, just like that day in House 7. Below, I could see the garden no longer Ellie's alone, but a community space filled with benches, solar lights, and the soft chatter of neighbors sharing soup recipes. And there, standing by the rosebush, was Camilla. I almost closed the blinds, but something stopped me. I walked downstairs and stepped out into the drizzle. She turned at the sound of the door. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know where else to go. I didn't expect you to." She looked older, smaller, no makeup, a softness I didn't remember. "I lost everything," she whispered. "No," I said gently. "You let go of everything you never really held." Her eyes welled up, but I didn't offer a hug or forgiveness, just a truth. "You didn't break me. You only revealed how breakable your world always was." She nodded. "You were always stronger than I thought." "No," I replied. "I just stopped needing anyone's permission to be strong." Then I turned, walked back inside, and left the door closed. That night, I found an old photo, me and Charles, young, laughing. The kids in the background blurry with movement. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just placed the photo in a drawer labeled before, because now I was living in the after, and for the first time, I liked the way it looked. When people ask how it felt to own the company that used to own me, I tell them the truth. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. But power has a funny way of echoing forward. Because one day I received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single page folded 3 times. Heavy cream paper ink slightly smudged. It read, "Vivian, you don't know me, but I knew your husband. I worked for Alder Properties for over 20 years under both Charles and Michael. I saw what they did, what they took, what they hid, including from you." There was a phone number and a final line. "There's more you deserve to know. If you're ready." I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to toss it into the fireplace. Another part, the part that had rebuilt herself from ash, picked up the phone. Her name was Denise, former bookkeeper, now semi-retired, running a small B&B in Vermont. When we met, she brought a canvas tote bag full of files. "Your husband was many things," she said, "but subtle wasn't one of them." She laid out records, memos, account transfers. And there it was. A shadow fund, opened in my name, closed weeks before his death. Funds moved into a shell company eventually absorbed by Alder Properties. Millions. All of it hidden. All of it mine. Or rather, should have been. Denise looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know what they were doing until it was too late." I smiled gently. "I do now, and that's enough." But later that night, I sat in bed holding the file to my chest. Not for the money, for the proof that I had never been delusional. That the love I had questioned, the doubts I had carried, the gut feelings I had dismissed, had all been pointing somewhere real. I didn't sue. I didn't publicize it. I did something quieter. I opened a fund, named it the Quiet Wife Initiative. Its mission: to support women who have been financially erased by partners, families, or institutions. Not a charity. A launchpad. Every dollar Charles siphoned without my knowledge now lit the fuse for someone else's escape. Ellie was the first recipient, followed by Rosa, then Danny's sister, then dozens more. Each woman a silent revolution waiting for her matchstick. And I just kept handing them out. One day, Leah walked into my office with an envelope. "A journalist wants to interview you again," she said. "About what?" She laughed. "About being the most quietly powerful woman in real estate. About owning their mortgages, their history, and still choosing not to destroy them." I thought for a second, then shook my head. No interview. Why not? Because the power was never in being seen. It was in being unshakable even when they tried to forget I existed. I no longer visited Charles's grave. Not out of hate, but because I didn't need to. He was in the buildings now, in the contracts I rewrote, in the women who signed leases without guilt, in the homes that hummed with something warmer than legacy, something alive. And that was more than he ever planned for. Or perhaps, exactly what a part of him always hoped I'd do. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come with answers, but with agency. By the time fall rolled around, the trees outside my office turned gold, just like they had the year Charles died. But this time, I didn't feel like I was mourning a season. I felt like I was harvesting it. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Ellie again. She'd returned with her daughter for a community workshop, and we sat in the courtyard where her roses still bloomed. "You look different," she said, sipping tea. "Kelmer." "I feel different," I replied. "For years, I fought to be part of a family that never saw me. Now I'm building one that does." She smiled, the kind of smile that makes you believe forgiveness might be real. "Did you ever think," she asked, "that all of this started with being cut out of a will?" I looked around. At the homes, the garden, the interns helping tenants carry groceries, the walls repainted in bold, unapologetic colors. And I said no. It didn't start there. It started the moment I realized I was never meant to wait for anyone's permission. That was the difference. Some women inherit empires. Some women burn the blueprint and build a better one. That night, I took out one last file from my drawer. A legal document I had asked Mara to draft months earlier but never signed. It transferred full ownership of the Wren Collective to a board of trustees made up of tenants, survivors, and the very women the trust was built for. No founder's override. No family stake. Just shared power. The final act in a story they never saw coming. I signed it with a steady hand. Because real legacy doesn't come from controlling the ending. It comes from letting go so others can begin. A few weeks later, I received a postcard in the mail. No name, no return address. Just a photo of a coastal town. And 4 words. "I see you now." I didn't know who sent it. Maybe Michael. Maybe Camilla. Maybe someone watching from the sidelines all these years. It didn't matter. Because the truth was, I had always been here. They just weren't ready to look. The final change I made to the old Alder building was replacing the door plate. It used to read, "Alder Properties Private Executive Office." Now it read, "The Wren Collective. Home starts here," and beneath it, etched faintly in the corner, "In honor of those erased." I stepped back, admired the sign, and walked out into the wind. Because I had things to do, not in boardrooms, but in living rooms, not with legal threats, but with open doors and second chances. They cut me out of the will, But I bought the company that paid for their comfort and turned it into a lifeboat for those still drowning in silence. Not for spite. For every woman who's ever been told she's replaceable. The wind outside howled gently as I locked up the main door of the Wren Collective for the night. The once cold brick building now glowed warm under new lights, solar-powered tenant-designed paid for by the same trust fund they never thought I'd touch. I stood on the front step for a moment staring at the horizon. It was quiet, but not the silence of loneliness. It was the quiet after a storm. The kind where the earth is wet, but the sky is clear. I remembered standing on these same steps nearly a year ago, trembling, unsure, humiliated. That was the day I found out I was cut out of the will. No mention, no apology, not even a token acknowledgement of the decades I spent beside Charles, holding his family, his image, his ego together. And now I stood above them. Not because I climbed over their legacy, but because I grew roots where they only built walls. Inside, the sound of laughter from the evening budgeting class still lingered. Women were learning how to read contracts, how to challenge landlords, how to protect themselves legally, the very skills I had to teach myself through pain. They were not victims. They were rising. Mara caught up with me just as I was locking the door. "Vivian," she said, handing me a small package. "This came for you." "No name?" "Just this." I turned it over. It was an old ledger. Inside, names, dates, properties, shell accounts, all tied to the original trust that Charles had established, ones he'd lied about closing. A note was tucked inside. "Your silence was never your weakness. It was your slingshot." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but it felt familiar. Like it came from someone who finally understood why I never screamed. I smiled, slipped the ledger into my coat, and said, "Let's get dinner." Mara nodded. "You okay?" I looked at her. This woman who had watched me burn down an empire and build homes from the ash. "I'm not okay," I said. "I'm awake, and I'm just getting started." In the days that followed, we announced the final phase of our initiative. A scholarship program for young women whose mothers had been cut out of their homes, marriages, or families. We called it The Unwritten Line, because sometimes the most powerful part of any story is the part they tried to erase. And as for the will, the one that excluded me, I never fought it, never challenged it. I framed it, hung it in the hallway between two community rooms, a reminder to everyone who passed through. This is how they tried to end my story. And underneath in brass letters. But here is where I began again. I once thought legacy came from being named in wills, in buildings, in family trees carefully traced and trimmed. But the truth is, legacy lives in what we rebuild after being erased. I was cut out of the will, but I didn't vanish. I didn't rage. I redirected. I took the company that paid their mortgage and rewrote its mission. I turned cold ledgers into lifelines. I built homes from contracts they once used to control and crush. And now, I walk through gardens planted by women who were told they were unworthy. I hear laughter in rooms once filled with silence. I see names, new names, etched on plaques, on welcome signs, on children's drawings taped to community walls. Not mine necessarily, but names I helped give space to grow. That is what it means to outlive injustice without becoming it. That is what it means to win quietly. If you are watching this and you've ever been forgotten, dismissed, or denied, let them keep the mansion. Let them guard the vault. You go by the entire street and rename it after every version of yourself they tried to bury, because your silence was never surrender. It was the space between chapters. And now, it's time to write louder. Subscribe to Grace's Truth to hear more stories of women who were erased, overlooked, but never defeated, where justice whispers and silence becomes power.